Hello. My name is Shadrach Abela and welcome to Liberty Sparks Academy. Liberty Sparks is a non-profit, non-political and non-governmental think tank with mission to improve and promote individual understanding on economic, social and political liberty, based in Tanzania, Kenya and Uganda. 2/3 of the world's population, in over 100 countries, live under governments that claim to be democratic. Yet few of those governments live up to the ideals of democracy, or respect its key principles and institutions. Here we have the author of Introduction to Democracy, Dr. Eamonn Butler defines democracy, explains its purposes, and shows the difference between genuine democracy and the many sham versions that currently exist. Eamon explains why it's important to have a clear understanding of democracy, and how easily it can be lost or abused when people do not properly understand it. Importantly, he asks why so many people today have become disillusioned with democratic politics, and what, if anything, can be done about it. Dr. Eamonn Butler is a British economist born 1953, he's a director of the Adam Smith Institute, a leading think tank in the UK. He holds degrees in economics and psychology, a PhD in philosophy, and an honorary DLitt. A former winner of the Freedom Medal of Freedom's Foundation at Valley Forge and the UK National Free Enterprise Award, Eamon is currently secretary of the Mont Pelerin Society. Butler is the author of many books, including introductions on the pioneering economists Adam Smith, Milton Friedman, F.A. Hayek, and Ludwig von Mises. He has also published primers on classical liberalism, public choice, Magna Carta, the Austrian School of Economics, and great liberal thinkers, as well as the Condensed Wealth of Nations and the best book on the market. His Foundations of a Free Society won the 2014 Fisher Prize. Please welcome Dr. Eamon.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. I want to talk about democracy, and it's an important subject because 2/3 of the world's population live in countries that at least claim to be democratic. But most of those fall far short of the ideal of democracy, and certainly democracy as I would recognize it. That might be due to their deliberately misrepresenting what democracy is, or it might be due to a lack of understanding. And I think there is a big lack of understanding about democracy, and that's really why I'd like to talk about it today. There are a number of countries, as I say, who I think deliberately misrepresent democracy. There's a large number of countries in the world that actually have the word democratic in their official titles. You've even got some in Africa, Algeria, Ethiopia, Congo, Western Sahara. These countries claim to be democratic, it's in their title, but they're not remotely democratic at all. They don't get into any of the indexes of democratic government. They might have the trappings of the show of democracy. They might have elections, they might have parliaments, they might have courts. But too often these are sham elections. The opposition are arrested and jailed, there's censorship, there's a state broadcaster, and nobody else can access media. That, of course, does not then lead to a democratic outcome because there is no real choice and there is no real debate. So democracy is often deliberately misinterpreted. But it is also very widely misunderstood. Too many people in the world think that the majority who win a democratic election somehow have unlimited power. And that isn't true. They can't do just anything that they want. There are limits. They can't confiscate property or deport people or torture people or practice genocide. That's not what democracy is about. You might be in power, but you can't do those things. That's not what democracy is there for. And the important point I really do want to make is that democracy only works if it's limited. Democracy is great. It's very good at doing certain things. It can't do everything, and it's not designed to do everything. And if you try to make it do everything, then you get into a mess. And democracy only works when it is limited. And that's why we talk here about limited democracy. We talk about constitutional democracy. We talk about liberal democracy. Liberal democracy in particular means that your rights are respected. They come before any democratic outcome. Democracy today doesn't mean what it used to mean in the era of ancient Greece. In ancient Greece, democracy was everybody getting together and making decisions about the laws and what should be done and who should be appointed to office. We can't really do that anymore because our societies are very much larger than ancient Athens or somewhere. And so what we actually have today is representative government. And that's actually what we call democracy. When we talk about democracy, what we mean is representative government. And that is a way to take collective decisions. There are some decisions, like perhaps national defense, that you can really only take together. You can't take it as individuals. Families can't take those decisions. So they have to be decided collectively, and that's why you need some kind of democratic arrangement. But I think the number of decisions that you have to decide collectively is actually very few. Most decisions can be made perfectly well by individuals themselves. They don't need governments to tell them what to do and how to think and how to run their lives. They can get on and do that themselves. They just need government for a few limited collective decisions. And you've got to remember that the process of democracy is not a group of angels coming together and telling us how to live and what to do. On the contrary, it's a group of politicians doing that, and that's a very different situation. And at every stage in the political process, it's about self-interest. Elections are in fact contests of different interests because the population all have different interests and they vote for their own interests. They vote for politicians who again have their own interests, might be a party interest as well as a personal interest. And officials who put the laws into effect, they have their own interests. And, you know, they want to secure their jobs, they want to grow their department and have lots of employees under them and have status. So there is self-interest at every stage in this process. It's not somehow a kind of pure process that we can rely on. When we talk about democracy, we mean politics, and politics can be very messy. So it's very wise to limit this political decision-making process to the small number of decisions that we really have to take by that means, and let people choose their own lives and their own actions. And indeed, that is actually the whole purpose of government, and it's the whole purpose of democracy. Democracy exists, and this thinking goes right back to John Locke in the 17th century. Government exists to protect individuals from force. It exists so that we can get on with our lives without other people pushing us around, using force against us, using fraud against us, committing crime against us. And that's why we have democracy, because we feel that in a world in which we are not subjected to force and violence, that we can live much more freely and much more happily. And that's what government is there for, to guarantee those rights. And democracy is there not to tell people what to do, not to enslave people, but to allow them to live freely. Of course, one of the problems is that that means that the government must have a certain coercive power, because it has to have police, and it has to have army, and it has to have courts and systems of punishment, prisons, and so on, in order to prevent people from committing crimes and using violence or fraud against other people, and to punish those who do, so that it discourages other people from doing the same. And if you have a government, you therefore have systems of force and coercion. It's natural. You can't run a government in any other way. But that in turn means that we need institutions to restrain government and make sure that that force is used honestly and legitimately, to prevent official force being used in an arbitrary way against us, or to prevent it from being used for the self-interest of those who happen to be in power at the time, who control all of those systems of force. And that means, as every good liberal knows, that we need a rule of law, that we need laws which apply to everybody, including our leaders, that they don't just apply to the governed, but they apply to the governors as well, that they have to respect the law and they can't make laws for themselves. It also means that we need independent judges and courts, that they can't be simply agents of the ruling government. They have to be independent so that they can hold the government to account. In many places, Britain isn't really one of them, we have constitutions which, again, put limits on the powers of those in authority, and say what government can do and can't do. Very important point I just want to make, which is that democracy is not about choosing our leaders. It's about restraining them. Democracy is not about electing leaders. It's about removing them from office when they do bad things. And that's extremely important to remember that. And if you have a system where the leaders don't get restrained, even by elections, and they don't get removed, even though they're voted out of office, somehow they linger on. That is not a democratic system. Democracy is about restraining our leaders and removing our leaders. And that's important because our rights are, if you like, prior to government and democracy. Democracy exists in order to protect our lives and our rights and our freedoms, and our economic freedom, our social freedom, to protect our property and to ensure that there is justice when things go wrong. That's what government is there for. But these rights come first. The will of the majority cannot override those essential, natural, individual human rights. I think to work, a democracy needs a wide franchise. It needs open elections. It needs those rights. It needs free debate. With debate, if you have open debate, then you can criticize your government. And that leads to more honest policy. And in turn, that leads to better progress, because instead of things being hushed up, put to one side, or the government just carries on regardless, even though the public hate what they're doing. Instead of that, you get debate, and lots of different people come into the argument, and they contribute their own wisdom, and you learn from that, and that is the way that policy is made. I think that open elections, open debate, also prevents the accumulation of power. Again, this is very much what we want out of democracy. We don't want people simply to acquire power and then grow their own power and then to stay in office for as long as they like, like the presidents of China or Russia seem to be doing. That's not what democracy is all about. Russia claims to be a democracy, but when I look at a country and basically its leader is there for life, then I think that is not a democracy, because democracy is supposed to prevent the accumulation of power. And if you have the right institutions, the open debate and open elections, and anybody can stand for election, that means that it's impossible for groups to acquire and maintain power, because eventually they'll get voted out of office. So it's there to protect our individual rights, but it also, I think, promotes peace, because we discuss our way out of problems in democracy. We don't need to have a civil war, and we don't need to have wars with other countries. We can discuss things with them. And it's interesting that most international conflicts exist between, armed conflicts, I mean, exist between non-democratic countries. Not all the time. Democracies do go to war against each other occasionally, but generally speaking, democracies don't go to war, because democracy is a system based on discussion, and you discuss your problems and you work ways out of them, rather than taking up arms against your fellow country folk or against foreign governments. So this again, I think, is another great advantage of democracy if you get it right. But it's not easy to get it right. Democracy, of course, grew up originally in Greece, but I suppose my own country, the United Kingdom, can claim a lot of the credit for building up parliamentary democracy. But it did take us many centuries to do that. And there were big fights between the monarchy and the public and parliament. And there were, we deposed the king. We had a civil war. There were lots of blood shed on the process. But eventually we found out pretty much what democracy is about and how it works. And what we know about it is that you have to be aware of the limits of democracy. The elected officers cannot do everything they want. They are there to protect our rights and our freedom. They cannot use their majority to override that. We must restrict government to its core purpose, the few collective decisions that can only be made collectively. We must resist the spread of government into other areas of life, telling us how to live, telling us, in Britain and America, they tell you how big your fizzy drinks bottle can be. Now that's just ridiculous. People can make up their own minds about how big a bottle of fizzy drink they buy. And you must restrain the people who run this system. That's what it's all about. You must restrain them from abusing their power, and you must get rid of them when they do. I think those are the essential lessons of democracy that I'd like to leave you with. So thank you very much for having me, and I hope you find that interesting. I can't hear you.
Sorry. Thank you, Dr. Eamon, for giving that powerful presentation. And the most great takeaways is that you have really given us this powerful message that democracy is not all about giving our elected leaders the absolute power, but restraining them. It's not all about putting them into office through election, but also it's all about removing them. Maybe what I can really ask you, Dr. Eamon, it's perceived that it's because of democracy is the only option for development of the people throughout the world. Maybe if you can tell us, how is this achieved?
Well, you're asking me how we can spread democracy across the world. Well, I think it's a very difficult thing to do. America, if you remember, had a program of spreading democracy across the world, and they were removing regimes like Saddam in Libya and moving into Syria and places, trying to get rid of authoritarian regimes and replace them with what they thought would be democratic regimes. It didn't really work. Because it's very hard to do. I think you have to grow democracy. I think you can't just take a Western idea of democracy and dump it on different countries around the planet and hope that somehow they will turn out to be democratic. They won't. Because every country is different. It's got a different population. It's got different history and traditions and culture. And sometimes democracy works in those environments. At other times, it produces almost the opposite of what you hoped for. I mean, in the so-called Arab Spring, for example, people at first were very pleased to get rid of dictators like Mubarak. But then you had a dictatorship of the majority, which is almost worse because it's got some kind of notional legitimacy because it's been elected, whereas a dictator hasn't. And so, you found regimes doing all sorts of illiberal things in the name of democracy. So I think it's very difficult to plant it across the planet. I think what you've got to do is work from the roots up. I think you have to enlighten people about rights, individual rights, and civic rights, and to grow it from there. I think once people enjoy rights of property, for example, and build up their own businesses and livelihood, and have a stake in the country, then I think they start demanding a say in how the country is run. And once they enjoy a measure of freedom, economic and social freedom, the ability to live and work as they choose, then I think they are more resistant to authoritarian governments. So I think this is something which you have to build up by education and by practice as far as you can to make as much progress on giving people rights, protecting their personal property, and giving them a stake in the country. Then they will demand a say in how the country is run.
Okay, that's well explained. Maybe if I can take you more further, you've explained about, as we see right now, we have some other states which are so prosperous. Let's talk of China, Singapore, and it's believed that these countries aren't that democratic. Do you see this as a reason why we have authoritarian governments in other states?
Yes, I think that you can have more or less democracy. You can have democracy of different types. I mean, Singapore is not really a democratic country, but it does respect the most basic human rights. Whereas China, for example, does not respect the rights of many communities, those in Tibet or the Uyghur Muslim communities. So there's no point calling yourself democratic if you don't respect those rights. And I think a number of countries do try to mislead us into thinking that they're democratic by having democratic in their title or simply claiming to be democratic, whereas in fact they're really quite the opposite. But there is quite a wide spectrum as to which countries really have all of the institutions that we think are necessary for what I call liberal democracy. And most of them actually are in Western Europe. It's France, it's Britain, it's Germany, it's Italy. It's interesting how many of the legitimately the most democratic, the most rights-respecting governments are in Western Europe. That's not to say that it can't be spread to the rest of the world. You know, these are powerful ideas, and I think as the world gets richer, I think that these ideas have much more force, because people with a stake in their country want to say in their country as well.
Okay, maybe if we can engage our participants, we are going to pull up a poll, and maybe to get to an understanding of what the poll will say after it has been put up. Okay, I bet everyone that voted, and the results are over there. You can see a good percentage, the 3% of the participants says, yes, they can see democracy in their country, and 16% they're like, no, they can't see democracy in their country. Dr. Eamon, what do you have to say about those results?
I think your audience is very optimistic. I mean, I'm told that I live in a democratic country, and yes, by most measures, yes, it is a democratic country. But then the government takes all sorts of powers over my life. You know, we've had the coronavirus, and we've been locked in our homes almost. We've been told we can't go out. I'm told that I can't smoke cigarettes in public places. I'm told that in some parts of this country, I can't even have an alcoholic drink outside. And we are being regulated as to how much sugar there's going to be in our food. So all of these things, and I think that's not what I call democracy at all. That's just simply interfering in our lives, and so that does concern me. So I think your audience is maybe a little bit optimistic, and I think probably you need to be more robust and say that yeah, okay, right, well, we have got a democracy, but it's not necessarily a very good democracy, and we need to make it a lot better and a lot more open, and have it respecting our individual rights much more than it does at the moment.
Okay. I can see one of our participants is saying the dictators in Africa have mastered how to play democracy in their favor. Let's talk of Paul Kagame there in Rwanda and Museveni in Uganda, are considered to be a product of democracy. Yeah, maybe if I can say something small about that is, let's take our case study to be Uganda, where they have a president for more than 15 years, I can say. And this president in Uganda, he has somehow controlling the institution. Let's take the judiciary, maybe, and the other arms of the government. How do you see these countries who perceive themselves to be democratic, but in real sense, the leaders who are in government, they have total or rather close to absolute control of these important institutions, which need to have the checks and balance so that the executive doesn't just take the whole control of the country?
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right. I mean, I can't talk about individual countries because I'm not sufficiently informed. But yes, I mean, around the world, there are many countries which, as I said in the introduction, say that they're democratic, have all of the look as if they have the institutions of open government and democracy. That they have elections, they have different candidates, they have public debate of a sort, but it tends to be a sham. And you know, in North Korea, for example, the ruling party is always elected with a majority of roughly 99.9. And you think when that happens, there's something just wrong, because you know there are enough people in any society to complain about the government that ought to show in the elections, but it doesn't, because the elections aren't open and they aren't fair. And there are many countries in which the opposition candidates are routinely rounded up and arrested and put in jail so that they can't be a threat to the existing leadership. And you've certainly seen that in Africa, but we've seen it in many other places, parts of the world as well. And there are many countries in which, again, you are supposed to have a judiciary, an independent court system, but it isn't, because the judges are appointed by the ruling party, and they are friends and agents of the ruling party. And if you are on the other side, then they will rule against you. And as likely as not, they will put you in prison. So all of those things are not democracy. And even if a leader or a party, as in the Arab Spring, even if a majority, gets, it could be a huge majority. It doesn't matter how big the majority is. It can be 99% of the population voting for this particular leader. That doesn't mean that they can do everything themselves that they want to do. They have to respect the rules of the democratic process, and that means respecting people's rights, which again, you see, hasn't happened in the Arab Spring. That we all thought, this is great, we're going to have democracy, people will have a say at last, and no, they don't. They have even stricter rules on their lives than they had under the old dictators. So yeah, you have to be constantly aware of this, and where possible, you have to be highly critical of it. And it's very difficult to do that in a country where the leading party controls the media. There may be a state broadcaster that doesn't allow other people on, maybe state newspapers and all the rest. It's hard to criticize them, and you put yourself at risk. But I'm so impressed. There's so many brave people in think tanks, for example, around the world, not just Africa, but the Far East as well, who live under these circumstances and who are brave enough to challenge the system and say that, no, you shouldn't have the power to do this. You should not have arbitrary power to put people in jail or to confiscate their land or whatever. I salute people who put themselves at risk to make those important points, because I think the future of the world depends on that being understood.
Well. Maybe if I can say, is the future of democracy becoming populism? Every liberal democracy is it's like getting towards populist government. What do you say about that, Dr. Eamon?
Yes, I'm very worried about this because I do think it's happened. It's certainly happened in my own country. It's happened in the United States. It's happened in a lot of places, and it is a problem of democracy itself. And it's one that we have to be aware of, and that we have to make sure that democracy continues to be limited. As I say, democracy, the idea started in ancient Greece or thereabouts, around that part of the world. But it flourished in ancient Athens and so on. And it was that everybody had a say, or nearly everybody. It was well, it was confined to men and not women, and of course adults, and foreigners couldn't vote, and lots of other things. So to some extent, it was a minority making the decisions. But everybody who was empowered to vote went together. They met together, and they decided what the laws were going to be. So everybody was involved in the process, and that's really quite different from what we've got at the moment. So what we have at the moment is representative democracy, where we all vote, and then we vote for representatives who in turn decide the laws and so on. But we have to be able to remove them when we don't like what they're doing. But the trouble is, I think, that the elements of democracy are very powerful, and the elements of restraint are much more difficult to urge on people. So you have a situation where there is public debate, and lots of people say, "Oh, we should do this." There are lots of people who are becoming too overweight in Western democracies, so we should limit the amount of sugar that goes into their food, and we should stop them from doing other things that might damage their health, like smoking and so on. And I'm against smoking. I don't like smoking, but if people want to smoke cigarettes, fine, they can do it. It doesn't affect me very much. But in a democracy, there is a tendency for people to assume that, well, because the ruling government is in power, that it has the power to impose all of these restrictions on individuals, and to say, no, you must live in this way. You can't have too much sugar. You can't smoke cigarettes. You can't drink alcohol. And that's not what democracy is really about. But it's populism. You see, you get a majority of the population, or at least a noisy part of the population, interest groups who make a noise, and they put pressure on politicians, and the politicians think, well, if I give them what they want, then I will get more votes, and that will keep me in office. And so you get this slow erosion of our rights under a democracy if you're not careful, because every interest group wants to push us around and make us do things that we don't really want to do. And so they will put pressure on politicians. Politicians will respond by changing the law because it's in their interest to do so, because the great majority don't really have much of a voice. That if you're in a minority, if you are, let's say that you are a farmer who produces a particular good, let's say it's tomatoes, right? And what you do is you get together with all of the other tomato growers and you say, oh, the tomato industry is in a very bad way. We need more government subsidies for tomatoes, and we need to keep out foreign tomatoes. Well, what then happens is that the politicians look at that and they think, well, there's a big outcry here about tomatoes. Most of the population couldn't care about tomatoes, and they certainly don't want to see tomato growers being subsidized and given special privileges. But they don't have, if you like, a concentrated interest in saying that. They've got other things to do. Whereas the tomato growers, it's extremely important for them to get this government favor. And so you end up with one interest group after another bidding for government favors, and then you find that you're no longer in a free country because the politicians have given in to all of these different interest groups who want to push us around. And therefore you have to be very eagle-eyed about that. You've got to be very careful not to let it happen. And that's why you need frequent elections, and that's why you need to get rid of governments much more than we do, I think.
That's very well, and that's very well elaborated. Maybe it could be not well for us to finish this session without talking about maybe the negative and positive rights. We all know that these are rights that oblige either inaction, which is negative right, or action, which is positive right. Dr. Eamon, maybe could you please talk about this in relation to democracy?
Well, yes, I mean, I think that the language of rights is unfortunate. You know, we speak about negative rights, and they're the good ones, right? And you think, well, that's not good. It's not great language, but there you are. And it simply means that nobody really has any authority to impose themselves on your right. So, you know, one of the problems is that it's not always clear what our rights should be. I mean, we have the right to life. I mean, I think everybody sort of agrees that. But at the same time, if someone kills another person, should they still have that right to live, or should they be executed? So you can have a legitimate discussion about that. And everybody should have a right to freedom of action. They should be able to say what they like, for example. But if that causes harm, I mean, for example, if they use their freedom, their right of free speech in order to stir up people to take arms against innocent people, should that be restrained? So, and property again, you should have a right to your own personal property, but could you do anything with it? I mean, if you live in a built-up area, can you turn your garden into a pig farm, which is very smelly and annoys everybody? Well, you know, in developed countries, we have rules about property, which mean that you can't actually do absolutely everything you would like with your own property. There are rules on it. So exactly where the edge of your rights stands is a matter of debate. It's a matter of culture. These are, if you like, the sort of political expressions of a moral issue. How far should we go? How far should you be able to have free speech? And then we talk about rights because that's the sort of political dimension of that moral dilemma. And democracy should be guaranteeing our negative rights in that sense. They should be stopping people from taking power over our own rights and our own freedoms. It's one of the difficulties about establishing democracy. You asked me about how to establish democracy in other countries. And one of the things that people do, of course, is to say, right, well, let's get together and we'll write a constitution. And the European Union did this a decade or two ago, tried to write a constitution. And what happens, of course, is that every interest group in the country comes out of the woodwork and says, well, we need a right to this and a right to that, a right to free education, a right to free health, a right to welfare. And those aren't really rights at all. Those are obligations on the rest of it, because other people have to pay for our education and for our healthcare and for our unemployment or welfare benefits or our housing or whatever it is. So quite often you get you get written into constitutions things which are actually grossly illiberal. And the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights, for example, talks about the right to free education. Well, that's not a right at all. That's an obligation on other people. And I'd love to see it, but it's not what democracy is there to do and to protect. It's the exact opposite. So I think you do have to be really careful about what rights we're trying to protect and what rights aren't really rights, but they're actually obligations on the rest of the community, and you're using democracy in order to pass your own costs onto other people. So you want something to happen, but you make everybody else pay for it. And that's why taxation in particular, you need very widespread agreement before you change taxes, because taxes are very easy to change. You can put taxes on particular classes of people, and that's a way in which interest groups can get what they want, but get other people to pay. So you have to be very careful about that, I think, and have maybe special rules on certain things. Certain things you shouldn't just need a majority, you should have a supermajority in order to do them.
That's very well. Maybe a last question that we can ask you, Dr. Eamon, before we get to our next poll. Is there anything as economic democracy?
Economic democracy? I think that a free market is an economic democracy. People think about economic democracy as, oh, well, we should all have a say in how wealth is distributed and what people do with their money. No, not at all. We live in an economic democracy when we live in a free market. And it is actually much superior to a political democracy for various reasons. And the reasons are because you go into the market every day, every morning, and you choose certain goods or services over others. You go to some vendors rather than others that you don't like. You choose goods that you like, and you don't choose goods that you don't like. And that sends a signal to the providers of those things and the sellers of those things as to what it is that people actually want and what it is that they don't want. And that changes production because producers want to sell as much as they can. They want to sell a good product and they want to have happy customers who come back. And so they look at those signals and they say, well, people aren't buying this product. We really should stop making that, but they're buying more of this other one. So why don't we make more of that and make it better? So that is a democracy. And the thing is that you're voting as a purchaser, as a consumer, you are voting every time you make a purchase. You're voting every minute of every day, or somebody is voting every minute of every day. Whereas in a political democracy, you get to vote, if you are lucky, once every 4 or 5 years. And even then, you're not voting for individual things, you're voting for a whole package. It's as if you're going into the market and they say, well, you can't have one banana and one orange. You have to have a whole basket of fruit, and that's it. And that's what you're getting in political democracy. You're being told, well, you have to accept our policy on healthcare, but you also got to accept our policy on defense. You've got to accept our policy on welfare. You've got to accept our policy on, whatever it is, transport. So you have to look at the whole package, and you only get to choose it every so often. Whereas in the marketplace, that's a real democracy because you get to choose every day. And I don't think you can improve on that. And the more things that you can do through the market process, as opposed to through public decisions about what should be bought and sold, I mean, the more you can do that, the better.
Very well. Maybe our ICT team can pull up this poll so that we can have a short discussion before we close our webinar. Okay. Now those are the results. I believe our participants really understand this, that the principle of democracy runs across a principle of tolerance, individual rights, the rule of law, and welfare for all, principle of majority rule, and etc. So, Dr. Eamon, you can see 75% of our participants say their country follow these principles of democracy, and a good 25% says no, it doesn't. What do you have to say?
Well, I hope the majority are right in this case, because that would be fantastic if it were the case. I think again, I think there is a kind of spectrum on these things, and I think that some countries follow certain principles of democracy, whereas they don't necessarily follow others. They might have, for example, an election process which is actually quite fair and honest, but at the same time they might have a court system which is corrupt, or they might have an election system which is mostly honest, but there's a few local election officers are corrupt. So I think it's probably hard to say that a country is completely following the principles of democracy or not following the principles. And I think you have to look at the institutions and say, well, how open and free and fair and uncorrupted are the institutions. And in most countries, there is a lot of corruption, even if you don't really see it. There are, it's things like the judges and so on are appointed, maybe not because they happen to support the ruling party, but because they come from the right families, or they come from the right background, or the right school in this country, we would say, or the right university. And so there is that sort of rather subtle kind of corruption of the institutions, which, again, I think you need to be very aware of and try to make sure that your institutions are as open as you can possibly make them.
Okay, that's very well. So we're heading towards the end of our discussion, and last but not I would like to say that thank you all the participants for taking your time to join this discussion. Your host here, my name is Shadrach Abala, and the guest speaker is Dr. Eamon. I'd like also to thank society, the NFS for their overwhelming support to help us pull this together with the Liberty Sparks team, both in Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. For that, I'd like to say thank you again, and we look forward to see you in our next session. Also, for those who missed out on this webinar, we shall be having it on our platform, social media platform, the Facebook, YouTube, from Monday. You can take your time and go through it so that you don't miss out. And if you'd like to watch it again, please feel free to visit our website and all our social media channels. Thank you so much, Dr. Eamon.
You're welcome. Thank you.
All right. Anything you'd like to say as we part?
Well, I'd just like to say what you people do. I think you are much braver than I am. I just write books from a very comfortable country, whereas you get out there and actually have to spread those arguments to real people in circumstances quite often which are hostile. So I think you do a wonderful job, and I hope that you carry on doing it, because, as I say, I think the future of the world depends on it, and no more so than in Africa, which really is going to, I think, be so much more important in the coming century.
All right, that's fine. we're sorry we missed out on Lynn. She could be with us today as the host who have seated in for her. She fell sick just the other day, and apologies. We're looking forward to have her in the next webinar.
I wish her well.
Have a nice time, participants.